Walsh, and I'm the president of the North Jersey Rail Commuter Association. And this is episode 2 of the Lackawanna Cut-Off. In our previous installment, we visited the Paulinsco Viaduct in Haynesburg, New Jersey. Today, we're going to talk about Port Morris Junction. Now, here we are at Lake Hopatcong Station, which is a very busy place, as a matter of fact, and was a very busy place when it was in operation back in the days of the Lackawanna and the Erie Lackawanna. Right now, the station building is undergoing restoration by a historic group that is doing funding and basically is redoing the entire station, including the roof. Now, the question you may have is, why are we here at Lake Hopatcong to talk about the Lackawanna Cut-Off? Well, the Lackawanna Cut-Off begins about a quarter mile from this location. Now, the railroad here is actually below us, and I'll explain why that's the case, because of basically the unique configuration of the platform and the tracks below us beyond the station on this side. Now, the reason why this was called Lake Hopatcong, or landing for that matter, is because Lake Hopatcong is a stone's throw from here on the other side of the railroad. When I say a stone's throw, I mean almost literally a stone's throw. But in terms of this particular station, why bring this into the whole discussion of Lackawanna Cut-Off? Well, this building replaced an old station and was opened in May of 1911. Now, as you recall, the Lackawanna Cut-Off opened in December of 1911. That's only about, what, 6-7 months apart. It's not a coincidence, as a matter of fact. For the Cut-Off was originally intended to open in August of 1911, but was delayed. This station here, therefore, in a sense, becomes the 4th station, or the 5th station, depending how you look at it, on the Cut-Off, even though it's not on the Cut-Off. Maybe we'll say associated with the Cut-Off. Going east to west, there were stations on the Cut-Off at Greendale, Johnsonburg, and Blairstown. And in the near future, there will be another station at Andover, which will be part of the New Jersey Transit Service. But the 4th or 5th station associated with the Cut-Off is this station here, the station at Lake Hopatcong. So what we're going to do is we're going to move down to the platform area and look down there and give you a little bit of a tour of what is basically the lead-in to Port Morris Yard and Port Morris Junction, which is really the subject of this particular installment. Okay, well, now we're down at the platform level here at Lake Hopatcong. This is now what is the present-day Lake Hopatcong Station, the New Jersey Transit Station. It's a shelter, unfortunately. The station, which from here is up on the hill, as I pointed out, is under restoration, but is not actually used as a station building. Actually, in the past, it's been a real estate agent's office, and now it'll be a historic building or museum operation. This is a very interesting place to be, and in fact, Thomas Tabor, in his book on the Lackawanna, called the Lake Hopatcong Station one of the most interesting stations on the entire 400-mile railroad from Hoboken, New Jersey to Buffalo, New York. There's so much that we can talk about here, but we're focusing on the Cut-Off, but you can't really separate the Cut-Off from Lake Hopatcong in many ways. Right now, there are 2 tracks which travel through here. New Jersey Transit Service, which goes to Hackettstown, New Jersey, westbound in the direction that you're looking at, in that direction, and then eastbound to Hoboken into New York City, looking down that way. What was here? Well, there were 4 tracks at one time, and actually 2 of those tracks were added in anticipation of the opening of the Cut-Off in 1911, the same time that the new station building was built. Now, because of this area here, demanded that the station had to be up on the hill. And in fact, there were steps that came down from there. There was a concrete walkway which went across here. And in fact, when Conrail took over the operation of the railroad back in 1976, they wanted to dismantle the overhead bridge because they thought it was quote-unquote unsafe. And they tried all sorts of things to try to take it down, and literally end up having to take it down with dynamite. So debatable as to how quote-unquote unsafe it actually was. What else was here? The Morris Canal came through here underneath this arch on the right-hand side. The left side, 4 tracks. The right side, the canal. Once again, Lake Hopatcong is just over this hill here. Not, when I say a stone's throw, maybe a 9-iron, you know, on a good day for me would be probably it. The station was a major station. At one time, Lake Hopatcong was a major tourist destination, and the railroad made the best out of it in terms of bringing tourists in and out of here, particularly during the summer months. There was also a trolley line which ran adjacent to the railroad and up to Bertrand's Island, which was an amusement park on the lake. You could actually literally take a boat on the canal from here to the lake. So you could say this was an intermodal operation here at Lake Hopatcong. But at least this gives you an idea of the relationship of Lake Hopatcong now to the railroad and its importance. But right next to us here is Port Morris, which is the main focus of our discussion today, and that's where we're going to head next to Port Morris Junction and talk about all that's over there. Hi, we've moved to Port Morris, what will be the new Port Morris Junction, or as New Jersey Transit has renamed it, UN. I'll discuss what UN means in a moment. If you look here off into the weeds and the leaves are a bunch of switch ties. We can presume that these switch ties at some point are going to be moved over here directly onto this track and build a new switch onto the cutoff. Now there actually is a switch from what this is this track right here adjacent to us goes into Port Morris Yard. The track beyond is actually the main line that goes to Hackettstown. Actually goes all the way to Phillipsburg and connects into Easton, Pennsylvania, down that way. But there actually is a track that connects between this track here and the cutoff, but that will be removed when these ties are installed on the right-of-way. Now, to give you an idea of the relationship here, we can turn around and actually look down back from whence we came. Right around the corner, around the curve, is Lake Hopatcong Station. Because of the sharpness of the curve, you can't actually see it, but there's the bridge that we were looking at. You can almost make out cars. I can see them going through the trees. So we're literally, I think, 1,300 feet, I think is the exact amount, between Lake Hopatcong Station and Port Morris Junction. Now, where the track is going to go is basically going to go straight, and we'll go past the tower on the right, in between this, where the signal is now, and the tower. And what we're going to do is move down there and take a closer look at what's there, and we'll talk about UN and what that means. Okay, so here we are at the temporary Port Morris Junction, or UN as it's called. If you look at the side of the signal box there, it says UN. For a number of years after the cutoff was abandoned, that was called Morris, or Morris Junction, or Morris Interlocking, presumably. But the question is, where did UN come from? It's not United Nations. It actually is the call letters of the interlocking tower, which is just around behind us there, or behind the photographer. Now, what is UN? Well, UN, when I said call letters, refers to the call letters that were used for telegraphy, or telegraphy, I guess it would have been called. In other words, for telegraph, and I guess maybe even into the telephone age, because eventually they did convert over to telephones. But there were 3 interlocking towers which looked similar to each other on the cutoff. This one here at Port Morris. There's one about 10 miles or so west of here at Greendale, and then at the opposite end of the cutoff in Pennsylvania, at Slateford, there was a 3rd tower. Now, let's look at the configuration here, at least temporarily, for the cutoff. You can see that the track here to our immediate right, or as you're looking at me, would it be to your left, your right? Well, it doesn't matter. But this track immediately here runs into the cutoff and is a temporary setup, if you will. The new track, or the permanent track for the cutoff, will run along this trajectory and very close to the tower. Now, the question is, well, why is it temporary here? Well, essentially, this is part of the yard here and at Port Morris. And in fact, we should take a look at Port Morris Yard around here. This was a very large yard. It still is, but when the Lackawanna established or built this yard, we're talking probably pre-Civil War. It did, and it still does, encompasses about 84 acres of land, running about 2.5 miles from here, all the way to Netcong Station. Why would you build a yard here is a question. Here we are on top of a mountain, more or less, at about 1,000 feet above sea level. Well, the term port doesn't refer to like a port per se on, let's say, a major river, but actually a port on the Morris Canal. And the yard here was really established to transfer coal from the canal to the railroad. But it became a major reason for why the cutoff was put here, because logistically the cutoff starting at this location was very was advantageous in terms of the operation of the railroad because of the closeness of Port Morris Yard. So what we're going to walk over to the yard, and we're actually going to take a look at where the Morris Canal crossed underneath the cutoff. Okay, here's the Morris Canal, where it crossed the Lackawanna Cut-Off. Now, where I just started was one abutment, and here's where I'm standing on the second abutment. In between was an open area where the canal went underneath the cutoff. Now, one of the things that was promoted about the cutoff when it opened in 1911 was that all of the structures on the line were made of reinforced concrete, all 73. That included stations, the 2 viaducts, overhead bridges, underpasses, culverts, and so forth. Well, it turns out that's not exactly correct. Only 72 of the structures were made out of reinforced concrete. This one was the only exception. This bridge was made out of steel. Now, unfortunately, I've never been able to find a picture of the bridge itself when it was in place, although there are photos of the bridge being built and of these abutments showing the canal. The reason why this particular bridge was made out of steel is that the Lackawanna anticipated that the canal, the Morris Canal, was going to be abandoned at some point. When they were going through the planning stages as early as 1906, 1907, they would have known that the the days were numbered basically for the canal. In the end, the canal would be abandoned in 1924. The canal was actually owned by the Lehigh Valley Railroad, but the canal was abandoned in 1924 for not only a lack of traffic, but it was also a nuisance. It propagated mosquitoes during the summer and the stagnant water. And so in any case, what happened was that the Lackawanna removed this bridge. Now the question is, how did they do that this was a very busy main line right here? I've never found any record as to exactly how this was done. One would think that the Lackawanna would have anticipated that they would have to do this quickly, and maybe they filled in underneath the bridge and then took out the bridge on a weekend, for example. Maybe had some kind of shoe fly operation around it, but don't really know exactly how they did this. They may have also shunted much of their traffic over onto the old road, which is the railroad that the cutoff replaced, or was intended to replace. They may have also used a Y track, which we'll look at in a moment, as a possible shunt for the time that this bridge was being taken out. We really don't know, but it was possibly one of those, because this bridge here would have basically required that something would have been done temporarily in order to keep the railroad operating. Now, as we look here, we see that there's already a mile or so of track on the cutoff that's been installed, and there's all this other track here that's sitting here. There's probably, well, given that there's about 4 miles of track that's been put on the cutoff as of this point, there has to be at least 3 miles that are sitting here. Now, back in 2011, December 2011, a rail train from Norfolk Southern came in from that direction up, would have come through Netcong, and came in here and actually delivered this track. All of it was offloaded at that point. There was already this mile or so of track that had been installed so that the train could come in here, and then that they could drag all this track off and temporarily store it here. Unfortunately, the temporary storage has been over 5 years. Here we are now, December of 2016. But some of this track has already been removed and put in 2 other sections that are beyond this, and which we will look at in future installments of this documentary. You can look at the cutoff here, and this is going to be standard, shall we say, what the cutoff is going to look like eventually, all the way from here to Andover. Andover being about 7 miles from where I'm standing at this very point. Concrete ties, 136-pound welded rail. This is welded rail right here, but this literally has to be dragged to wherever it's going. And in fact, when the 2 sections I referred to were installed, going back in 2011, they had to literally drag these across a road down the way here. It's Brooklyn Stanhope Road, County Road 602, and they had to drag it in some cases several miles to the location which it was being installed. So we're going to next move to the Y track, which is also a place of great interest because of not only operations but a little bit of history as well. Here we are at what would have been called West Port Morris, or where the Y track from Port Morris Yard came onto the cutoff. First we'll talk about the locomotives that are here. These are temporarily here. They're Alp 44 units, which were used for Midtown direct service off of the Morristown line starting in 1994, and have been decommissioned and are temporarily here until they're scrapped. There's quite a few of them actually that are being stored here. Beyond the beginning of the locomotives, for a while there were a number of arrow cars, the multiple unit electric cars that were being stored here as well, but they have since left. Here you see all the track that is waiting to be installed on the cutoff, that where there's presently no track except for those 3 sections. In the middle here is where all the ties are being stored. Presumably maybe about 3 miles worth of ties, in other words, enough to install the remaining 3 or so miles of track on the cutoff. And then beyond here, you can see there's some wooden ties. Not really sure what to make of them. And then there's some of these unusual looking black ties. I've never seen these before. They seem to be of some sort of material that I'm not familiar with, almost like a steel or a plastic, or I don't really know what it is, but they're different, definitely different than the white concrete ties. So not really clear whether there's something intended for them to be used for. In fact, they look like they've been drilled in place here, so this is very recent that something's been going on here. Now over here is this road, which is not really a road at all, but is actually the former Y track for the cutoff. You can pan around here and look that it kind of just basically switches into where the main line is. The Y track will play an important part for the operation of the service on New Jersey Transit to Andover. What's going to happen, let's say the first morning that they run service to Andover, a train out of Port Morris Yard will run down the Y track through here and will switch on to the cutoff. It will run as what they call a deadhead move. Now, what's a deadhead move? Well, I'm sure anyone who's familiar with railroading knows that, but for the folks who are not, a deadhead move is a non-revenue move. In other words, there are no passengers on board, only the crew. So the crew would take the train, the engineer, the crew, take the train from Port Morris Yard all the way to the end of the track in Andover, and then would open up and take passengers and then go from there to on their revenue run. At the end of each day, the same thing would happen, only in reverse. The train would stop at Andover at the end of its run and then would deadhead back here, switch on to the Y track, and then go into Port Morris Yard for the night. Now, this particular place has a little bit of history, which we could talk about, but the one that I guess is the most interesting is the 1958 runaway, which occurred here. What had happened was about a dozen cement cars were parked at this location on the Y, and for some reason the brakes were not set, and the set of cars began to drift away down the hill, basically. The cutoff from where we are is 1,000 feet above sea level, is all literally downhill. There's maybe just a little uphill near Greendale, but essentially it's all downhill. Well, those cars started picking up speed, and by the time they made it to the Delaware Water Gap, were thought to be doing in excess of 70 miles an hour. And they ended up in the Delaware River at the point of gap where they, the speed limit on that particular curve, there's 40 miles an hour, so you imagine a string of cars doing 70, basically went straight instead of going around the curve. But that started here. There's a legend that they sent a locomotive after the cars to try to catch them, but it's not really clear whether that's true or not, but in any case, if they even tried it, they certainly were not successful. So that's the Y track here. In future installments, we'll talk about the rest of the cutoff. But this is really one of the most important parts, not only of the historic cutoff, because this was where it began its westward trek across northwestern New Jersey into Pennsylvania, but operationally for New Jersey Transit, for the new service that'll start up in a few years, this will be a key point. So thank you for all your attention, and then look forward to our next installment on the Lackawanna Cut-Off.